right, I'm excited to welcome you today to class. We're going to be talking really about Brazil's old republic. It is to say Brazil's first republic, the government that really comes into being in 1889 and that will exist through the year 1930. In terms of a broad overview of what we'll be doing today, I'll talk a little bit about how the old republic in Brazil functioned. This is a moment when we'll focus on some particularly important states in terms of the history of Brazil. From there, however, we'll talk about opposition and forms of protest that existed in Brazil during the old republic, particularly in the 1920s. And here we'll talk, among other things, about intellectual resistance. We'll talk about popular resistance. We'll talk about military resistance as well. And this last factor will play a role in an electoral crisis in 1930 that will bring an end to this period of Brazilian politics. It will bring an end to the old republic. But anyway, that gives you an overview of what we're going to be doing today. Before we do it, I need to show you the vocabulary that we'll be covering. And so I'm going to pull that up on the screen in just a moment. I would suggest that you pause so that you can write all of the vocabulary down. Okay, and here's the vocabulary. Again, I would suggest that you take a moment and pause. You'll see that there's quite a few terms that I've put up here, and then I put spaces in between them. And those spaces are just to indicate really different elements of the lecture that will come together, the different parts that will come together to form the lecture as a whole. But anyway, go ahead, push pause, and write this stuff down. Following the military coup that essentially drives Dom Pedro II from power in 1889, Brazil is set up for a brief period of time with a provisional government, which will eventually give way to the creation of Brazil's first republic. And as I said, I want to talk a little bit about how that first republic, what is called the old republic, how that functioned. And to begin with, I need to show you a map of Brazil. I want to talk about some especially important states in Brazil during this period of time that played an especially important role in terms of the functioning of the old republic. So let's pull that map up. And here's our map of modern Brazil, and I just want to take a moment to highlight really the most important states in Brazil during this period of time in terms of the functioning of the old republic. In this regard, you have two states that are especially important and a third state that, depending upon the circumstances, can step in and play an important political role on the national scene. But our most important states are the states of São Paulo down here and Minas Gerais. Our other power broker in all of this that I'll speak about in a moment is in the south of Brazil down here, Rio Grande do Sul. But let me start by talking a little bit about Minas Gerais and São Paulo and the important role that they play during this period of time. Okay, I commented that Minas Gerais and São Paulo are especially important. In terms of just some quick background, these two states together during this period of time account for 41% of Brazil's population. Not a majority, but fairly darn close. On the other hand, they only account for 13% of Brazil's landmass. But you've got a lot of people in Minas Gerais as well as in the state of São Paulo. Together, these two states will take in half of all the revenue that the government takes in Brazil. Most of the roads in Brazil are found in these states. The railroads are found in these states, and so on. And so anyway, these states are especially important in terms of the national political process. In terms of this, the real political process in the old republic is not really the elections themselves, but rather the bargaining that precedes the elections. And in terms of this, you'll have individuals, really kind of patrons, you could think of them. They'll be referred to, now we refer to them today, and even in this day and time, as coronéis. It would be like a colonel, as it were. But these might be your power brokers, particularly in rural areas. A coronel would be somebody who could get out the vote. And so, if you want elected office, you need to have people that can get you that election. And a coronel, corones is the plural of this, would play a role in terms of getting out the vote. In terms of some additional background, Minas Gerais and Sao Paulo, both of these states really make their money with large rural estates, with plantations and so on. Agriculture is especially important. And of course in Brazil, agriculture is tied to the country's export economy. And so this gives these states a reason really to want to control national politics, because foreign policy, in terms of trade, for example, will play a role in terms of the wealth of these two states. Final point, in terms of the states of Minas Gerais and Sao Paulo, 40% of the electorate are in these two states. So essentially, if the people that are resident in Sao Paulo, that are part of the electorate, and the people resident in Minas Gerais agree on who they want to be Brazil's next president during this period of time, that individual is going to be the one who is elected president. Anyway, because of all of this, the importance of Minas Gerais and Sao Paulo, you'll frequently see politics during this period of time referred to as the politics of coffee and of cream, or that is to say, café com leite. Coffee and milk is how they say it in Portuguese. But Sao Paulo is a place where coffee is especially important. Minas Gerais is a place where cattle and raising cattle on these great rural estates and ranches are important, and that's where you get your cream, your milk, as it were. So anyway, the politics of the Old Republic is in many ways the politics of café com leite, of Minas Gerais, and of Sao Paulo. And I wanted to show you a little, what would you call it? A little kind of schematic representation of how that plays out in terms of the election of Brazilian presidents during this period, the period of the Old Republic. And I'm going to pull that up on the screen right now. Okay, and this image here, this figure, I don't know if you can see at the top, it says Café com Leite, Brazilian Presidents by State, 1889 to 1930, what we call, again, the Old Republic. And what you see is you frequently have just an alternation between presidents that come from the state of São Paulo and presidents who come from the state of Minas Gerais. You can look here, Prudente de Moraes, Campos Salles, Rodrigues Alves, these are all Paulistas. Then we switch over here to Minas Gerais. We switch back to São Paulo, Minas Gerais, São Paulo. It's the politics of café com leite. And again, so long as the inhabitants, the electorate in these two states agree on who they want to elect, that person is essentially going to become Brazil's next president. That being said, there is a caveat in all of this, a place for a third state, Rio Grande do Sul in the south of Brazil, that I showed you before to play a role. Again, so long as Minas Gerais on the one hand and Sao Paulo collaborate together, they can elect whoever they want. But if there's a disagreement at all between these two states, it opens up the way for another state to come into play here, to create an alliance with Rio Grande do Sul as to who is going to be elected. In terms of Rio Grande do Sul, again, if I go to our map that we were looking at before, you can see that Rio Grande do Sul is in the south of Brazil, down in this area, right down here. This was a state that was important. It had a strong military heritage, as it were, and this military heritage, as we'll see, will play a role in the future of Brazil beyond this as well. But you could think of Rio Grande do Sul as a kind of balancing state, as it were, that keeps things running. In terms of some other background on Rio Grande do Sul, it has the highest literacy rate of anywhere in Brazil. By 1930, a quarter, 25% of the inhabitants of Rio Grande do Sul, gauchos as they're called, 25% could read and write. And that was above any other state in Brazil during this period of time. Rio Grande do Sul, incidentally, as well, also will have the highest percentage of immigrants to Brazil. Generally, these immigrants were from Germany, lots and lots were from Italy as well, but it has a lot of immigration from Europe. Anyway, the politics of café con leite, how things are functioning during this period of time. And again, Sao Paulo and Minas very much want to control things because of the importance of their export-based economies in terms of the future of these two states. Now, if Sao Paulo and Minas Gerais really control things during the Old Republic, it means, among other things, that other states will be left out in many ways of the process. And this will lead to frustration on the part of elites in other parts of Brazil. It will lead to frustration in terms of other elements of society more generally as well. The point I would make here is that the Old Republic does not solve Brazil's problems. In terms of this, especially beginning in the 1920s, you're going to have really resistance on the part of different elements of society to the Old Republic more generally, or to what I would call the Old Republic. In terms of resistance to the way things are working in Brazil, it will take various forms. And I want to introduce you today broadly, with specific examples, to three elements of this resistance. First, we're going to talk about intellectual resistance to what is going on in Brazil during the Old Republic. From there, we'll move to talk about popular resistance, and we'll conclude with military concerns and military resistance as well. And that will lead, as I said in the preface today, to the overthrow of the Old Republic on account of an electoral crisis in 1930. But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's start with intellectual resistance. In 1922, Brazilian artists and intellectuals will gather together for a week where they will exalt local and national ideas and really reject, in many ways, the European ideas that had made Brazil what it was up until this point in time. This gathering that takes place in the city of Sao Paulo in 1922, specifically between February 11th and February 18th, 1922, where again, intellectuals, artists, musicians, and so on will gather together to celebrate what it means to be Brazilian, and again, to reject what had traditionally been conceived of as, fundamental to Brazilian culture in terms of literature, in terms of art, in terms of music, as we shall see as well. In terms of the people that gather together, in a moment I'm going to review these names and I'll show you their pictures, and I'll go through some of this a little more slowly. But the intellectuals who gather include musicians, among others, Heitor Villa-Lobos. In terms of some background, he is a celebrated musician, a celebrated composer who was born in 1887. He'll eventually die in 1951. In a moment, I'm going to play you some of what he wrote over the course of his career. Another person, a person that really played a fundamental role in gathering all of these people together, was a character who's a little bit older. Many of these intellectuals were younger, but this fellow was a little bit older. His name was José Pereira da Graça Aranha. You'll see him frequently referred to simply as Graça Aranha. In terms of background, he's born in 1868. He will eventually die in 1931. But he was a Brazilian writer. He was a founder of the Brazilian Academy of Letters in 1897, alongside Machado de Assis, whose novel I had you read last time. But anyway, he is a pioneer of the modernism movement in Brazil, and he lost a lot of friends over this gathering because, again, he had come from more traditional notions of literature. Finally, another character who was there at this National Art Week is another writer. His name was Paulo Prado. he was born in 1869. He'll eventually die in 1943. He would go on to write a work that was called Retrato do Brasil. Retrato would be like, painting an image of somebody, their face and so on. It would be a retrato. So it's an image of Brazil. And in this work, he argued that Brazil and Brazilian history was about four major themes, and that these themes were legacies of earlier times and places, really legacies of the colonial era. But let me introduce you to his themes that he writes about, his frustration with what Brazil had become, and then I want to cut away to pictures to show you who some of these characters are. We'll play a little music at that point as well. But anyway, Paulo Prado, what does he argue Brazil is becoming from its past? His first theme, he argues, is that the history of Brazil is about sexual exploitation and sensuality. And here he's drawing upon, of course, notions of miscegenation and racial mixing, exploitation on the part of Europeans when Brazil had been colonized, really conquered by Portugal. So, number one, sexual exploitation and sensuality. Number two, he argues that Brazil's history has often been about greed. And he makes the connection. He says, in Brazil, people want to pick fruit without planting the trees. Number three, Romanticism. And he was skeptical. He was frustrated with the Romanticism that he saw in Brazil. He argued, among other things, that Romanticism does not lead to progress. It leads to just looking at the past in a kind of romanticized sort of way. His fourth theme is a term that I've actually briefly introduced you to before. It's a word that really doesn't have a translation in English. He called his theme saudade. And again, this is a term that speaks to notions of sadness, notions of longing. You'll recall when we talked about Pedro II abandoning Brazil when he was, I say abandoned, I mean he was driven out of Brazil in 1889, that he looked back with saudade, a kind of longing, a kind of homesickness, a sadness. Again, there's just not a way to translate this word. But anyway, the point that comes out of all of this, these intellectual figures, the writings of Paulo Prado, his Retrato do Brasil, and so on, is that intellectuals in Brazil in the 1920s are very much just disenchanted with what Brazil has become. They're disenchanted with the political system, the social system, of course, the culture and the arts, and so on. And really, disenchantment is a larger theme of the 1920s in Brazil. But let me just cut some pictures. I want to show you who some of these people are. Again, I want to play a little music for you as well. And here we have one of the three organizers of the National Art Week in Brazil. This is Graça Aranha that I told you about before. Again, he was older than some of the individuals that were very much part of this movement. He was a founding member of the Brazilian Academy of Letters. He came from tradition, and he wanted this to be a way to connect Brazil's older writers and intellectuals with the rising generation, if you will. Anyway, he's one of the main organizers of National Art Week. He was assisted by the poet Mário de Andrade, also by a painter Emiliano de Cavalcanti. Together, they hold this event at the Municipal Theater in São Paulo in February 1922. In terms of all of this, it doesn't go over necessarily as well as they had hoped for. Graça Aranha will basically, practically, be kicked out of the Brazilian Academy of Letters because of the role that he plays in terms of this. Due to the radicalism that at least the critics of this day and time see, and the people who come to attend as well, in terms of the poems and the music that is being shared, the artwork, there was a bunch of plastic art that was going on as well. Again, this is kind of the beginning of the modernism in Brazil during this period of time. Anyway, on account of this, People will be booed as they're sharing poetry. The audience will pelt as well some of the speakers with tomatoes and other kinds of vegetables. But anyway, Graça Aranya, the founder, one of the founders of National Art Week. This is Paulo Prado that I told you about before. Again, he writes this work later called Retrato do Brasil, where he, expresses frustration, really disenchantment, as I said, with what Brazil had become by this point in time, and really blames it on legacies from earlier periods of time, the legacies of the colonial era that I shared with you earlier. Now, other individuals come out of all of this as well, and this is a character that I want to say a little bit more about. He is a composer. His name is Heitor Villa-Lobos. Again, he's born in 1887. He will die in 1959. He arguably today is one of Brazil's most famous classical composers, maybe one of the most famous classical composers born really in all of South America. Over the course of his career, he'll write orchestral, chamber, instrumental, vocal works as well, all sorts of things. He is essentially self-trained. There's all sorts of stories about him, but the story goes that when he was a young boy, he used to creep to the stairs to listen as his father would gather musicians downstairs to play and to compose and so on. But anyway, I say self-trained. He never really gets along with the people that are trying to teach him how to do things. And so he teaches himself and he learns to play various instruments. He teaches himself to play the cello, the guitar, the clarinet, and so on. And he goes and he performs in bands for a short period of time and really like theatrical orchestras to make a living and so on. Beginning in 1905, there are all sorts of stories that are told about his life. That he abandons the coasts of Brazil and goes deep into the interior, trying to discover about indigenous music and what it meant to be Brazilian. The idea here is he wanted to learn indigenous tunes and so on, things that were native to Brazil rather than being brought to Brazil from Europe. Anyway, who knows if half the stories that are told are true. He talks about once nearly being captured by cannibals and barely escaping with his life, and it's thought that a lot of what he says is really, exaggerated, if you will. But anyway, the story of Heitor Villa-Lobos fits into this larger tale. It's about Brazilianizing the music that was on the scene in Brazil in the 1920s and thereafter in the 30s and 40s and beyond. Again, he has a very, very long career. You can see him here when he's relatively young in the middle. You see him when he's an old man. You see him playing all sorts of stuff. I want to play to you some of the works that he uh, really did over the course of his career. And I want to start with something called the Choro Típico, number one. It basically is a guitar piece that Brazilianizes, again, you're going to see this in a lot of the stuff I'm going to play for you here, Brazilianizes, European musical forms during this period of time. So let's start with the Choro Típico, number one from 1920. Okay, and I want to play you another piece. This is from 1930. It is called O Trenzinho do Caipira. And essentially, he composes a piece that sounds like a moving train. Take a listen. Now, this next piece is from quite a bit later. This is towards the end of his career. He wrote this in 1958, around 1958, for a movie. And so, he's scoring movies as well in all of this, but it's called Floresta do Amazonas, the forest of the Amazon. And it really has a very avant-garde sort of a feel. Listen. And the final couple of pieces here I'm going to play are from his so-called Bachianas Brasileiras. Essentially, he takes conventions from Bach, from other, European classical traditions, and Brazilianizes them. Let's listen to the Bachianas Brasileiras number 1. We're going to listen to the part that is the fugue. He wrote this in 1930. And the final piece I want to share is another one of his Bachianas Brasileiras. This is Bachianas Brasileiras number 5. It's an aria. And as you listen, I'd like you to just recall how I explained that the 1920s is an era of disenchantment. And perhaps as you listen, you can hear that play out in this piece. Now, just as there is intellectual frustration and resistance, if you will, to the old republic, there are other forms of resistance and protest as well. And I want to turn to what I would call more popular forms of resistance with a couple of specific examples, both really corresponding, speaking to a region of Brazil that in many ways is being left out in the midst of all of the changes that the old republic brings, and in the midst of a time when São Paulo and Minas Gerais and Rio Grande do Sul are the states that are really calling the shots. That takes us to the northeast of Brazil, to the story of a priest, Padre Cicero. Padre Cicero was a young priest from Ceará, in the northeast of Brazil in the late 19th, in the early 20th centuries. Again, what we're talking about is this northeastern region of Brazil up here. Ceará is a very dry, very, very poor state traditionally, especially during this period of time, in the northeast of Brazil, right here. And Padre Cicero, got a picture of Padre Cicero at this point as a young man. But in the 19th century, the late 19th century, he was a young priest. And he ministered during his youth, really, to those affected by terrible droughts and poverty in Brazil in the 1870s and into the 1880s and so on. In 1889, the very year in which the empire fell and a republic would be declared, the story goes that he performed his first miracle, and that the host turned to blood in the mouth of a woman to whom he had given this Catholic sacrament. And thereafter, pilgrims from all over begin to arrive to come see Padre Cicero, who has done his first miracle. In time, Padre Cicero will become a political power broker in this northeastern region of Brazil. No political figure could get elected without his blessing. Essentially, he's becoming a type of coronel, if you will. These, great rural patrons who have say in terms of politics and so on. Ultimately, out of frustration, his followers will go on to attack the capital of Ceará in 1910. State troops will try to get them. They'll try to get Padre Cicero, but they'll ultimately fail. Today, he's very much a legend in the Brazilian Northeast. He will finally die in the year 1934. But he and his followers, in many ways, again, speak to notions of resistance and the fact that a part of Brazil is very much being left out as Brazil modernizes, as the old republic, as it were, moves forward. Now, other forms of resistance that I could speak to in terms of this northeastern region of Brazil take us to the stories of the bandits who terrorized the northeastern countryside in the 1920s and the 1930s and so on. They are referred to today and at the time as cangaceiros, Cangaceiros. And cangaceiros were bandits that really act as strongmen in the interior of the northeast of Brazil, really beginning in the 1880s and into the 1890s and continuing during the period, really, of the first part of the 20th century, up to roughly about 1935. Between 1910 in this regard and 1935 is the great age of the Cangaceiro movement. The most famous of these bandits I have pulled up for you here. His name is Lampião, and he was an utter terror. Today, he is considered a folk hero, as it were. People celebrate him. Think of like Bonnie and Clyde in terms of U.S. history, or think of Jesse James and so on. But in his day and time, this bandit, Lampião, glasses, cowboy hat, and all, was an absolute terror and a serious threat to authority in the northeastern part of Brazil. In terms of becoming a folk hero, Lampião and his cohort of bandits will really be celebrated by the time you get to the 1950s and the 1960s. They'll be romanticized. That being said, in small towns in the interior, everyone is absolutely terrified of this character. He and his compatriots will become heroes for people that didn't have to live where they operated. But let me show you Lampião, his band of brothers. Here you can see one of his fellow cangaceiros next to him. And this is his whole troop, along with his girlfriend slash kind of common law wife, Maria Bonita, Mary the Pretty. And again, the cangaceiros. Ultimately, Lampião and others who fight beside him will die in a firefight with government authorities in 1938. His head will be decapitated. That is to say, he will be decapitated to really prove to the local inhabitants that he is dead. And thereafter, his head will actually be put in formaldehyde in a Bahian museum until 1969, when it will be buried. In terms of the heads, look away if you don't want to see, but let me show you the next image. This is 1938, after government authorities have finally vanquished Lampião, who's in the center at the bottom of the piece, and all of his fellow cangaceiros. But anyway, I'm going to get off of that image. I tell the story of Lampião, of these cangaceiros in the northeast of Brazil, again to speak to the fact that a part of Brazil is very much being left out in terms of the way the old republic functions. I also bring up his story because some scholars argue that banditry, social banditry, stealing from the rich, or stealing from anybody for that matter, is an archaic form of social protest, and that it can indeed be at least semi-political. So anyway, the story of Lampião and his cohort of cangaceiros again speaks to popular forms of social protest during this period of time. Well, earlier I indicated that the 1920s was really a time of disenchantment in all sorts of ways. We've talked about intellectual disenchantment. We've talked about popular forms of protest and unrest. The final point I want to talk about is what I would call military, not a military response, but rather military resistance to the current system. And this is brought on, among other things, by electoral crises. And I want to introduce you to a few of these and the manner in which they play into the minds of a rising generation of young military leaders. But let's start with an electoral crisis. In 1921-22, there is a presidential election. And it is a contested election. The states of Sao Paulo and Minas can't agree on who is going to become the next president. Thereafter, people become disenchanted with the electoral process. And this leads, among other things, to a military uprising of very young cadets, army officers, that begins in Rio de Janeiro on July the 5th, 1922, and which will eventually spread to Sao Paulo. It is called part of the Tenentes movement in Brazil. Tenente in Portuguese is T-E-N-E-N-T-E. And literally it would translate like a lieutenant, if you will. What we're talking about here are young army officers. They're at the beginning of their career, and they are disenchanted with the system. Just like the intellectuals, just like, the poor in the Northeast, these young army officers are disenchanted as well. And so on July 5th, 1922, in Rio de Janeiro, there is an uprising of these young tenentes, these cadets. Ultimately, officers, their superiors will be imprisoned, troops will be killed, and so on. Ultimately, it is put down. That all being said, other young army officers, sympathetic to what happened and to the uprising that occurred first in Rio, and again, it eventually spread to Sao Paulo, will thereafter begin to plan another uprising. And again, 2 years later, to the day, July the 5th, 1924, a new uprising is planned, this time in Sao Paulo. Tenentes rise up. They're angry with their superiors. They're angry with the system and so on. Ultimately, these young tenentes will be able to get out of Sao Paulo. They will flee down to the south of Brazil, to Rio Grande do Sul, where they'll be joined by others, and their numbers will begin to expand and grow. And among those who joins them was a young, very idealistic officer. His name was Luiz Carlos Prestes, and he will go on to take on the moniker the Knight of Hope. But anyway, let me show you a picture of a young Luiz Carlos Prestes. I want to talk about what becomes of this initial Tenentes movement and what Luiz Carlos Prestes goes on to do with it for the remainder, really, of the 1920s. And here is an image of Luiz Carlos Prestes, a young military officer. He was a captain who will eventually become the leader of what had begun as this uprising in Sao Paulo in July of 1924. But anyway, in terms of some background, Luiz Carlos Prestes is born in the year 1898. He'll have a long life, a very long political career, actually. Eventually, he will die in 1990. But in terms of some quick background, at this point in time, he was a captain in Rio Grande do Sul. He'll eventually become the leader of the remaining Tenentes, and he'll lead them on a march through the interior of Brazil for the next 2.5 years. Over the course of this period of time, they will cross back and forth across a variety of Brazilian states, from Rio Grande do Sul down here. They'll come up, they'll go through Mato Grosso do Sul, Mato Grosso, all sorts of areas in the interior. More than 25,000 kilometers over the course of these next 2.5 years. And this group of men that have joined him, that are on this grand expedition, there's ultimately around 1,500 of them to start out with, will come to be known as Prestes Column. And he himself will come to be known as the Knight of Hope. Eventually, in 1927, the group will disband. Luiz Carlos Prestes will flee across the border, going to Bolivia and then into Paraguay. In Bolivia and Paraguay, our young, energetic military officer will read Karl Marx. And this is the pre-Karl Marx Luiz Carlos Prestes, and this is the post Carlos Marx, Luiz Carlos Prestes. But anyway, from there he'll go on to have a lengthy political career. He'll spend a good deal of time in his kind of formative period after this, actually in the Soviet Union. He becomes the head of the Communist Party in Brazil and so forth. But anyway, let me just show you some images of Prestes Column, these young military officers that are frustrated with the future, as it were, what has become of Brazil. And here's another image in terms of Prestes Column. So anyway, what we have, among other things, is military unrest as well. In the midst of all of this, there is an election. In 1926, it is an uncontested election in which a Paulista, and I've shown a picture of him here, Washington Luiz, will become the next president of Brazil. In terms of some background on Washington Luiz that you see here, by training, by trade, he is a historian. He's a historian of Sao Paulo, really, during the colonial era. I actually cite him in my dissertation and in my first book as well. I cite Washington Luiz. But anyway, I told you he comes to power in 1926 in an uncontested election. Point I would make here is the election of 1926 really ushers in, for a brief moment, a period of reconciliation. During this period of time, coffee was making money. Things are going relatively well, as it were, although you have all the setup for people to begin to question how things or will go in the future. In terms of some quick background on coffee and so on, in 1906, an institute had been set up in association with really the state of Sao Paulo, in which the state of Sao Paulo would buy up coffee and not put it on the market in order to control prices. What we're talking about here essentially is a valorization scheme. You limit supply and you can make it so that the prices go up. By the 1920s, period when Washington Luiz, that you see here, is in power, the central government in Rio de Janeiro had come to control the supply of coffee. So things are going well. Coffee is doing well, and yet people are beginning to ask questions. What about other industries? What about other places? How come the central government is only helping Sao Paulo? How come it's only interested in coffee and so on? And in this regard, elites that are left out, middle classes as well, very much are becoming disenchanted with the government, with this valorization scheme that is helping the coffee planters of Sao Paulo, the people who elected Washington Luiz to office. In 1929, of course, we have the stock market crash. The stock market crash ultimately hurts Brazil very, very badly. And this sets things up for another election. In this case, a contested election that will ultimately usher in the end of the old republic. Well, the end of Brazil's old republic was ultimately brought on by an electoral crisis in the year 1930. At this point in time, you've got a contested election. Again, Washington Luiz, that I just showed you, was the president up to this point in time. There's a new election going on. In terms of that, a new election, it is contested, as I said, between Washington Luiz's candidate of choice. The man he wants to succeed himself, whose name was Júlio Prestes, and the opposition. The opposition was in the form of Getúlio Vargas, who was from Rio Grande do Sul in the south of Brazil. Had served for, we'll talk much more about Vargas moving forward in class, but had served for a period of time as a governor and in various other capacities as well. But anyway, Getúlio Vargas is running against Washington Luiz's candidate of choice, Júlio Prestes. In terms of Getúlio Vargas running as an opposition candidate, he has a running mate who's running to be the vice president of Brazil, whose name is João Pessoa. So anyway, we've got opposition candidates. On the one hand, we have Washington Luiz's candidate of choice on the other. Ultimately, the election is held in 1930, and Júlio Prestes, the candidate of the current government, wins the election. This being said, there were cries all across Brazil of electoral fraud, that Júlio Prestes should not be allowed to come to the presidency. This all being said, before Júlio Prestes could take his oath of office and so on, take the reins of power from his protege, Washington Luiz, a conspiracy will be launched by the Brazilian military, which will drive both Washington Luiz, the current president, and his soon-to-be successor, Júlio Prestes, from power. And this military coup, essentially, will be precipitated by the death of Getúlio Vargas's running mate, João Pessoa, who will be murdered in an ice cream parlor in 1930. To the opposition, the government opposition to the military, it looked as if his death was a political assassination in response to their cries of electoral fraud. Realities are much more complicated, and the man who killed him had really a personal vendetta against him that involved love letters, it involved mistresses, it involved all sorts of things. Anyway, ultimately, he is assassinated by this personal enemy, and this will set off a military coup. Initially, the military commanders who lead the coup want to keep power for themselves, but pressure from the political opposition to the government, and I haven't given you this term yet, but the Aliança Liberal is the opposition to the current government. Pressure from the Aliança Liberal is too great, and ultimately power will be turned over to Getúlio Vargas to serve as a provisional president of Brazil. Vargas will go on to dominate Brazil's political scene really for the next 24 years. Ultimately, the legacy of his time in power will continue long after he was gone, arguably until the very, very end of the 20th century. In class next time, we'll talk more about Getúlio Vargas. Let me just take a moment. I want to show you some images that speak to this military coup, to the assassination of João Pessoa as well. And I'll use these pictures again as a chance to review basically the crisis that sets off the end of the old republic. Well, to begin with, here I have pictures of both Getúlio Vargas, a politician from Rio Grande do Sul that was running in the presidential election of 1930, and of João Pessoa, his running mate, running to be the vice president, who was serving also as the governor in the northeast of Brazil at this point in time, in the Brazilian state of Paraíba. But anyway, here are our running mates. This is Getúlio Vargas. This is João Pessoa. Again, this is a contested election. Washington Luiz is the president at this point. His candidate of choice is a character named Júlio Prestes. And ultimately, Prestes will win the election. Vargas on the one hand, João Pessoa on the other, will be defeated. This all being said, shortly after the loss of the election, as the Aliança Liberal, the party that these two individuals are a part of, are calling out that there was electoral fraud, that Júlio Prestes should not be allowed to come to the presidency. In the midst of all of this, the political infighting, João Pessoa is assassinated in an ice cream parlor in his Recife, where he'd gone to get himself an ice cream. And here you can see João Pessoa is dead. Now, for the military, for Vargas, for many people across Brazil, it seemed that the government was out to kill João Pessoa as retaliation, essentially, for these cries of electoral fraud. And ultimately, this precipitates a military coup in 1930 that will drive Washington Luiz, that will drive his, hand-picked successor, Júlio Prestes, from power. As I said, here you can see our João Pessoa. Here you can see people coming out. This is as his body was being moved after he'd been assassinated in his Recife in the northeast of Brazil. People gathered to watch the train come in. Why is he killed? Really, it was a personal vendetta. It involved a jealous husband. It involved love letters. It involved all sorts of things. It was very, very complicated. But for the military for Vargas, it was seen as, the government out to get João Pessoa. And so ultimately, the military moves into Rio de Janeiro. Here you can see the train coming in. On the back of this train is Getúlio Vargas. Here you can see him there. And here you see him. Here you'll see he's in a military uniform. Getúlio Vargas is coming to assume a provisional presidency. This is the beginning of the end for Brazil's old republic and the beginning of the presidential career of Getúlio Vargas. And again, Getúlio Vargas will go on to dominate Brazilian politics really for the next 2.5 decades, all the way up into the 1950s. His legacy will go on far beyond this, in really to the end, you could argue, of the 20th century.